I left home and college and school at the age of 16, not because I wanted to necessarily, I didn't know that I was transgender, essentially. I knew I wasn't homosexual, but I had an attraction to men. And I always used to think when I was young, and I started, I suppose, manifestations of what would become my transsexuality began at 4 or 5 years of age. It tried to be conditioned out of me by parents and adults around me, whether it be through physical or verbal abuse. That's what happened to a lot of us. But at 16 years of age, when I did discover what trans was and that was, I found my path, I never looked back. Nobody could ever tell me that I was going to be anything other than what I needed to be. And that came at huge cost, huge sacrifice, huge risk, huge danger. I had no idea, really, that I was going to dive into an abyss of social opprobrium, social exclusion, institutional prejudice, discrimination, hatred, and all of that. Lowest of the low, scum of the earth. Our employment opportunities extraordinarily limited if we were to live as we were, regardless of what the society thought. And for each and every one of us that made those brave and courageous steps to say, I have to be who I am, I cannot live a lie. This is the cost I have to pay for this. And people are still making those courageous steps these days. I just happened to be elected in our country and turned out to be the first one. But that helped to open a door, I think, for many other political aspirants of our community to think, well, if that can happen in New Zealand, why can't it happen in my country? Because I just happened to be a transsexual woman, the first one in our parliament, and apparently I'm credited with being the first in the world to make that step and break that ceiling. Of course, I was going to be supportive of any matters that might come before our parliament that have a direct effect upon the rainbow community, including transgender. And I most certainly did when those matters did come up in my time in parliament. For example, our civil unions, the Civil Union Act that we passed in 2004, along with the Statutory References Amendment Act, which amended over 100 other statutes of our parliament to include same-sex for civil unions. I was elected in a rural, conservative, some would say redneck area of New Zealand. You would have thought that I would be the last kind of person that they would have entrusted me with their vote to be their representative in Parliament. And so when these matters came up in our Parliament, civil unions, prostitution reform and things like that, of course I was going to support any improvement on the punitive way that those matters had been dealt with prior to these pieces of legislation passing. Because I take it from my own lived experience. I've been a former sex worker. That's how my origins had started when I was transitioning. And it was a cruel, nasty place, and the world and the law were against us. And when I found myself in a position of influence, I wasn't about to dilute that by trying to just play the ball. I was happy to take the political risk. If the electors in my constituency were not happy with me, they had the opportunity to vote me out at the following election. But I would have still stood proud by standing by those things. Otherwise it would have been a wasted opportunity on my part if I hadn't been able to support those things. And I took that risk. So when I was re-elected to Parliament, they doubled my majority. Prior to colonisation, there was a place in Māori society for people who were gender different or may have, these things existed. And I would say not just in Māori society, Pacific Island societies, and many other societies of Indigenous peoples from around the world. They existed pre-colonisation. The instant that well, in the New Zealand context, Christianity was introduced to Māori, forced upon them almost. Then the concepts of same-sex anything was a sin. Transgender just wasn't even a word in those times, and Māori were made to comply, I guess, with Christian values, which altered and differed. They welcomed some of those values, but on the other hand, it also helped to diminish the influence of Māori culture itself. It was also a colonisation of our minds, and not just by the influence of those, the British essentially, who colonised New Zealand, but religion itself changed our spiritual concepts. As Māori people, we've always had to fight to not only be heard, but to be understood, and to be able to articulate well enough where we are coming from, that we don't actually want to we're taking nothing away from you. And I do get worried that you have an obsession, an unhealthy obsession sometimes, all of you naysayers, to what's between our legs. It's none of your business, and it doesn't actually hurt or affect you. It is only the concepts that have been introduced to you as being bad and sinful through your faith and beliefs, and therefore it's an easy cop-out to demonise, dehumanise people who you view as being a minority. The mark of a civilised country, a civilised society and a civilised democracy is how well you take care of your most vulnerable. And I think rainbow and transgender communities can be considered in that category of being very vulnerable, because we are not the majority, and therefore the tyranny of the majority tends to reign. There's danger fraught in many ways for seeking our human rights. Our human rights should be the same as anybody else's human rights. Simple as that. I've been fortunate to live in a democracy that's allowed that to progress. Patience is a virtue. Things take time. Societies take a long time to change in your favour. But with the upsurge of beyond the Pentecostal churches, we now have white supremacy. We have the Trump-type era of hatred that has fanned other people who have felt frustrated about it, and that's a very dangerous place for we as a rainbow community, and for people of ethnic difference. And you know, these are things that those of us who have an opportunity to change, alter in being appointed, elected into influential positions, to make sure that we keep on the agenda these matters that need to still be addressed and acknowledged. And I'm lucky to live in a country that has a bit of a struggle occasionally, but we talk it through, we debate it, and we respect each other when we have that debate. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists have risen up to become very transphobic, because we want our gender identity to be officially recognised in our laws and our statutes, and everything that comes off that, whether it be your legal documents, whether it be your right to identify yourself and have that properly recognised, it's vital, it's important to us, it's a matter of life and death for many of us. We need to be able to access our health services in a way that complements us. Our penal system needs a radical overhaul when it comes to dealing with transgender people. They don't do it at all well. It's punitive, it's horrible, it's not right. We haven't found the solutions properly yet to how to deal with it. I mean, it'd be very simple to sit there and say, well, if you don't want to go to jail and end up in the penal system, don't commit the crime. But sometimes just being who we are ends up being the crime. We have managed to win over a majority of New Zealanders who are in our favour when we pass laws like civil unions, like marriage equality. With civil union, we had a terrible venal national debate over it all. It was very destructive. We hadn't seen that kind of venom coming from the naysayers to us since we had the debate in 1986 or in the early 1980s over homosexual law reform. And yet, a decade or so after civil unions passed, just in about 2011, if I remember correctly, an out gay Māori woman called Louisa Wall presented a members' bill to Parliament for marriage equality. And by the time that bill went through its processes in Parliament and the national debate took place, there was polling done. And a majority of people in those polls were saying, of the country I'm talking about, were saying, for heaven's sake, give it to them. So attitudinal change is very important when you're dealing with conservative societies. Yes, there was a long time that passed between civil unions and marriage equality, but when marriage equality came, you had the country saying, do it. They're on our side. They believe in what we were requesting. Many of us are dying, and it's been like that for a long, long time. It's only now we're getting more reliable statistics on just what that number is of us. Many of my contemporaries are dead. And not necessarily just from suicide. Sometimes it's because of the oppression of our life and our lifestyles back in a time where the law worked against us. Sometimes it can be a long, slow death, drug addiction, mental health issues, all of those kinds of things. So it's not just a matter of somebody committing suicide. I tried to commit suicide about 3 times myself in my very young life, late teens, early 20s. I had, the brutality of society, I think at the time on us, our only security came from each other and being able to be with each other, and we lived on the fringes of society. It was a very difficult time. We honour those who have passed on by striving to achieve what they never had a chance to enjoy. And the activism needs to continue. It needs to be a marker point you come back to. Too many of us have died for this. That's why I'm doing this. That's why we've got to change this. That's why we've got to convince the wider society that this is wrong. Don't talk to me about human rights if you won't even think of ours as being rights. Not at all. We need to honour those people and remember them. It's a tragedy when people are rejected from their families because of their coming out. And what are those people usually mostly concerned about? It's those friends or those family people that are prepared to give you the flick like that because it's their embarrassment, it's their shame that we're worrying about. Who are we to carry that burden on our shoulders and give us all the grief and mamai, as we call it in Māori terms, on our shoulders while we're trying to grapple with our own gender identity, sexuality, orientation. And it is so cruel, really, that that happens. So what do we do about that? We need to make our parents, our people close to us, feel that there is support for them too. Because I can imagine the shock, the recoiling of your child not being normal and all of that, and suddenly they've got all of this comes down on them. They seem to blame themselves quite often. Not their fault at all. It's nobody's fault. This is a natural occurrence. We need to convince the world of that too. I can only say, remember fondly and with deep sorrow those we have lost unnecessarily, the potential that has been lost. Every person in this world, including us, has a right to be positive participants in our societies. We're taxpayers, we're workers, we want equal rights just like you. And I think it's a very simple argument really, and one that sort of wins it every time. In Māori, and certainly in my tribal area, Te Atiawa, we have the raukura feathers. 3 white feathers that we put in our headdress are like that. Peace, love, goodwill to all people. I think it's what most people want. So when we lose friends, dear ones, family, through suicide because of the conundrum of being transgender in our current world and all of that, that's an indictment on a society that does not take care of all of its most vulnerable. But that should give you the motivation, the impetus to say, this has got to stop. I can do something to help it stop. So keep motivated, keep up the action for as long as it takes. We have a strong transgender activism in New Zealand. They are emboldened, they are well networked, and they're quite well supported from within the community. Their relationship with politicians is growing stronger, and the links are very strong into our parliament. Of course, New Zealand now has this distinction that proportionally we have the largest rainbow membership of politicians in our parliament. We have 11 rainbow politicians in our parliament, either men or women. And sadly, we haven't had another transgender person in yet, but I'm sure that's going to occur in the not too distant future. You need to network, you need to be researched, you need to be active on your social media, as well as actually you need to build bridges and liaisons with our allies and identify who those allies are. You need to take tips from the union movement about how to be activist and get out there and make it known. Find platforms on which, beyond social media, mainstream media is usually helpful to get your word out there. Network throughout your country. Resourcing that helps to sustain your movement toward these things. Strong connections with your politicians. If you have the opportunity to have politicians in Parliament who are sympathetic to your cause. But it is vital and important that we have that recognition in the statutes of our legislatures in whatever country that we're in, because then that gives you something to hang on to that our Parliament, broadcasting to you from the Rainbow Room in the Parliament of New Zealand. The Rainbow Room is a select committee room among numerous select committee rooms in this Parliament. I have sat in this room when I was in Parliament chairing select committees in here. To have a specific room in our Parliament that is dedicated and affirming rainbow in our country is a pretty important symbolic gesture. And on the walls we have the flags that are pertinent to all of us around the world that represent our differences as a rainbow community, whether it's the trans flag, the progressive rainbow flag, the rainbow flag. Many, we have them here sitting in this room. And at the other end of the room we have 6 pieces of legislation that have given us more freedom than we ever thought possible to this point. It ain't over yet. Starting from homosexual law reform in 1986, and then the rest of the pieces of legislation, Human Rights Inclusions in 1993, Civil Union Act in 2004, and then we had marriage equality not long after that. I'd mentioned earlier, along with civil unions, we had our Statutory References Amendment Act that amended over 100 other statutes to include same-sex civil union and couplings. We had the expungement of all criminal convictions for men who were convicted of homosexuality prior to law reform. That was very important because many of those people are dead now, but those who are still alive, their lives were destroyed by those criminal convictions. And a formal apology from our government, our parliament at the time over that. And of course, most importantly, we had our marriage equality, which I mentioned earlier. We have a world of intelligentsia amongst the transgender and rainbow community. We need to draw on that resource. We need to draw on the experience of those who have gone before us. If they are still with us, pick their brain, seek their wisdom, their experience, and then that gives you a view on how you can move forward, I think. And it just informs you better on how to go forward. So yeah, love each other, support each other, respect each other.